first speaker today is Josh Nelson. He's going to talk about React, obviously. And Josh used to live in Australia. And you can complain to him about Jira because he works at Atlassian.
Thanks, Josh.
Awesome, thank you. Yes, feel free to come up to me in the break. I make absolutely no promises if you have any questions about Jira, but I'll give it my best shot. Like was mentioned, I'm going to be talking about React today. I'm going to start off with a talk that's a little bit meta. We're going to talk about how to talk about React and how to explain it. So for context as well, my name is Josh and I'm a developer at Atlassian. And over the past years, we've been using React as a framework, and a big part of that is building platforms, which is components and things that people can use to actually make React UIs. And a large part of that is that we need to explain things to people. We have our APIs and we have components, and we need to explain, even to everyone at Atlassian as we're adopting React, how React actually works. So I've spent a lot of time trying to explain React to people. For more information, you can get the slides. There's a link down in the bottom left-hand corner, and you find me on Nelson Josh Paul on Twitter. But the idea is that if you are new to React, or also if you have a lot of experience in React, you can both get something out of this talk, because we're going to be talking about how to explain it to new people. But before I do that, I want you to think back to the worst teacher you've ever had, right? Probably didn't take long. Probably someone has immediately jumped into your mind as, yes, that was the worst teacher that I ever had. And you remember like gym class or math. It's like, yes, that particular person. And I want you to hold that person in your mind. All right? And now think about the best teacher that you've ever had. Probably a very different person has jumped into your mind as the best teacher that you've ever had. And you can hold that in your mind too, and just think about that person. Now, I want you to tell me if you recognize this person. I'd be extremely surprised if you did, honestly. He's not a celebrity or anything. That's Dr. Paul Francis from the Australian National University. So it's pretty unlikely that you would actually know who this is. But he's my first year physics lecturer. And this is the best teacher that I ever had. Things that made him the best teacher: he was really focused and passionate about engaging the class. He was a scientist, and he actually went really far in his science as far as experimenting on teaching methods on our class to see what methods worked the best. He really cared about it. And not only that, he was passionate about the topic that he taught too. He taught physics, and as you can tell by like the funky space desk thing that he's got on there, that's a big plus too. And he really cared about the topic that he was teaching. But my point is that we remember our teachers. We remember the people that teach us things. And you can ask anyone these two questions of the best or worst teacher that they've ever had, and you'll get stories. People remember these things. And why is it that they do? I think that the reason, or a huge part of it, is that learning is a massive part of life. You did a whole bunch of learning throughout your life, and so does everyone. It's a large part of what we do as human beings. In fact, the first thing that anyone does in their life, they start learning. That's the first thing that we do. So, how much do you think, in terms of percent, have you spent learning throughout your life? Or how much do you think I have? Well, it's a trick question. That's actually 100%, right? We spend our entire lives learning, literally from day one. And a huge portion of this is through formal education. So that's through things like schools and lectures, and even this conference today. We're going to be learning a bunch of stuff today, and people are going to be explaining things, particularly about React. So what are we learning now? Yeah, React. This is a React conference. I'm talking NationJS, but specifically React today. But why would we want to bother talking about React and trying to explain React better? So to give you an outline, first up, I'm going to talk about why you would bother trying to explain anything at all. And then I'm going to talk about why it's hard, particularly in the case of React, why it's hard to explain React to people. Then we're going to talk about how people learn in general and how to apply that to React. And then finally, we're going to give you some motivation to go out and try and explain it better to people. So why would we bother? There was this recent survey, the State of JS survey, which went out, which was quite interesting in terms of results. But what percentage of front-end developers who took this survey do you think have used React? I want you to raise your hands if you think it's more than 50%. Right? Yeah, got a lot of hands. It's actually 65%. Yeah, 65%. So that's a huge number, right? More than half people have tried to use React. So that's quite interesting. But on top of that, the thing that I find most interesting is that this number is up by 7% from last year. So there's an increasing number of people who have used React as a percentage. And again, this is up from 2016 to 17, it was up 10%. So this number just keeps growing. And the percentage keeps growing, but also we're getting more people who are doing front-end development. So there's a growing number of people each year who are learning React specifically. Okay, so there's something to be done there. These people need to learn. But in terms of like teaching, why would we bother? We can just ask them to read the docs, right? Just, there's heaps of documentation and blogs online, just like send them a few links and they'll figure it out themselves. I'm going to give you some reasons why it's worth putting in extra effort to try and explain React to people and why you should be doing it personally as well. So the first reason, you can multiply your own personal effectiveness. Do you want to be a 2x or a 10x or a 100x developer? I think probably everyone wants to be effective, right? And be like 10x or whatever that means. I'd say probably the way that you can do that, actually, if you really do want to be that, is that you can teach people and you can help them learn something. So making someone understand something better will help them achieve more, which is good for you in that you can teach them to do things that you would want to do in your team, but it's also good for them and good for everyone. If you want to be more effective, you should be trying to teach people. Here's something that really hit home for me as far as trying to teach people things. If someone in grade school today could be on your team by the end of your career, that's the type of time frame that we're thinking about. The people who are in grade school now, you're going to be working with them. We should be trying to teach them well, right? That's effort well spent. So let's care about teaching for that reason. On top of that, it's your responsibility to try and teach people. As engineers, part of our job is to develop software, but another huge part of it that we don't spend a lot of time thinking about is how do we explain that to people. Software needs to be understood by people and humans too. But not only do we need to explain it to engineers, there are non-tech people that we need to explain things to as well. We need to teach product managers and designers, or your parents, or anyone. How many times have you had this conversation, which is like, what is that React thing? Or like, what do you do every day? And you're like, well, React is like it's a thing where we had that conversation dozens of times. And we need to have that conversation well so we actually impart some understanding to people. And the last reason is that you learn when you teach. So there's this story about Richard Feynman. He was once asked by a Caltech faculty member to explain why certain particles behave the way that they did. He gauged his audience perfectly and he said, okay, I'll prepare a freshman lecture on it. But a few days later, he returned and said, you know what? I couldn't do it. I couldn't reduce it to the freshman level. That means that we really don't understand it. And what a conclusion to come to, that just because you can't actually explain it at a freshman level, that we must be missing some part of our understanding. And I think the reason is that there's a huge link between being able to explain something and fully understanding it. So you'll find by trying to explain it to people that you'll uncover your own gaps in understanding as well, which is a plus for you. So let's get on board. Let's try and explain things to these new people effectively and teach them well for all of those reasons. But now let's talk specifically about React. Is React hard to learn? So I'd like another show of hands. Who thinks React was easy to learn? Put your hand up if you think it was easy to learn. Okay, we've got some people, or if you're learning now, yeah, easy to learn as you're learning it. So it's easy to forget, but people have different experiences when they're learning something, particularly React. I've got this quote here from Brad Frost, which says, I'm going to be honest, I've had a hell of a time getting my head around React. More than any other technology I've touched over the last 10 years of my career, I just haven't had it click for me. It's very frustrating, as I really want to learn it, and it's clear the library has legs. This is from Brad Frost, a developer evangelist, and this is from a person who's been in the industry for 10 years at least, and already knows lots of stuff about front-end, but they're finding it difficult to learn React. How could that possibly be when there's some people here and who said that they find it easy to learn React? And the answer is kind of obvious. It's just that people learn differently. We need to understand how people learn to know how we can explain it to them more effectively so that we can overcome this difficulty. So now we're going to talk about learning in general and then how we can apply that to React. So the three things that I want to cover here. The first is mental models. Second, learning in bits and individual pieces. And the last one is active learning. So the first, people learn with mental models. So for the question before of whether React is easy or hard to learn, there's no definitive answer to that. React isn't objectively hard and it's not objectively easy. React will be easy to understand for some people and hard to understand for a completely different set of people. And people come from different backgrounds, which means that they have a different set of mental models. That means that the core concepts of React will be easier or harder for different people. And we need to give people a good set of mental models to work with for React specifically. I'm going to talk more about this later and give some examples of good mental models to give people. A way of imparting a mental model to someone is with an analogy that they find useful and effective. And I'll have some good examples of that soon too. The second way that people learn is by in pieces, like learning the bits. So if you think way back to when you were learning language, you can think about the techniques that your teachers had used with you. So there are a couple of different schools of thought on how you can teach these things. You might have had word lists or sentences where you have just a long page of words and sentences, and we just say, read all of these, and you kind of learn by rote, and you say, like, that's how this word sounds, and that's how this word sounds. There's a different approach, which you might have had, which is reading it out loud, where you're given a word, like read, and you're asked to sound out the individual syllables. So, ye, read. And from that, construct the whole word. So those are the different approaches. The second approach is the phonics approach. Research shows that people actually learn better with the phonics approach. So breaking things down into those individual pieces is an effective way of learning a bigger concept, like a word or a sentence. And you can combine them in different ways to pronounce words that you've never seen before. This applies to programming too. We should be teaching the small individual concepts so people can compose those and break down new concepts they haven't seen before once they fully understand those little bits. That link there is to a really awesome talk on the topic, which is about programming in general, but it's talking specifically about how this approach can be used to teach children and people in general how to program, which is really awesome. And the third part is learning as active. People learn better when they're engaged. So a way of doing this in a one-on-one setting, you can ask questions regularly. But when you're thinking of the questions to ask people, don't ask questions like, does this make sense? Which is often met with vague stares and empty nods and like, yeah, right, like, that's not a useful question to ask and doesn't keep them engaged. A question that forces people to be engaged is what or why questions. Like, what would happen in this situation? Or why is this piece of code important? That's a much more useful way to engage the person that you're talking to and keep them thinking about the topic. Another point to this is that you should be prepared to change tacts. What keeps someone engaged may not keep another person engaged, and so you should try and figure out what the best way that they're learning is. Okay, so how can we apply these tools to React? How can we use those to teach React specifically? And I'm going to cover a couple of different ways. So the context for React, we can talk about that. I'm going to give some examples of good mental models for working with React. And then I'm going to talk about some of the challenges people have with the bits of React. So number one, context. Context is important. And I imagine we're going to talk about the word context a lot today, but more so in the React sense. That's not the context that I'm talking about here. I'm going to be talking about the context that people come from when they're learning React. So maybe people who have learned React, or maybe yourself, you've known Angular before, and Angular was the last framework you have worked on, and now you're learning React on top of that. Or maybe you come from a background where you've done jQuery, and React is the next thing that you've done after that. And so when you're thinking about React, you're comparing it to jQuery in your mind. Or maybe they're actually a theater major, and they've done no front end whatsoever, right? Like, there's heaps of different backgrounds. It's not even just the programming ones. People are entirely different. So the point here is that others won't understand React the way that you do. And this was really a major revelation for me personally as well. When I had this conversation with one of my friends, which went like this, I was explaining how front-end and React worked and how I was really excited about it all, but they had a really different idea about it. And they said to me, front-end stuff just moves so fast. I learned JavaScript a year ago, and the next time I came back, everything's different. And that made me realize they have a really different experience of React than I do. I've been working with React for a little while, and I've built up knowledge over time, but for someone who's just coming in today, that's a really different experience learning React. It gives you an entirely different experience to build it up over a long period of time than it is to learn it all at once today. So the people that are learning today are having a really different time than how it was to learn React if you've even had like 6 months experience. So that's something really useful to keep in mind. People are learning differently today than how it was to learn when you learned. Second, mental models. How can we give people a good set of mental models to work with React? So you've probably seen a diagram something like this before, and this is a useful mental model to give someone to help understand the overall picture of how React works. So there's a store which renders into a view. The view can dispatch actions, which has some logic associated with it, which then updates the store again. Actions can also come from the outside, which has some logic to update the store. So this is a useful overall mental model to have about how a whole application works. And then it's useful to point out where React fits into that. So React is this bit. React is the view layer of that overall model. And having this as a mental model and knowing where to place this new concept like React into that model is a really useful thing. So here's a quote from someone who had described this as their aha moment when they thought they really understood React. And they said, React is really just the view. I was like, that's it? And yeah, that's a useful way to think about it. React is the view layer in that overall model, but once you have a framework in which to place this new idea, it becomes much easier to understand, and the big picture is much easier. Another example of useful mental models, there's this zine, which is called You Got This, and this is really awesome for a number of reasons. It doesn't really assume very much like background of programming at all, but it's explaining React. And the types of analogies that are used there are ones like in the example there, soccer or football, I don't know, whatever. So you have actions happening like goals are being scored, which updates the state, and the scoreboard is the view of that state. And so React is the scoreboard in this case. And so there's a lot of really useful examples of this, and it's useful for someone who comes from a background of having no other framework to compare it to. There's a URL for that. You can download it at that one down the bottom, ie-you got this on tinyurl. I actually also have printed out a couple of copies of this. So if you're learning React or know someone who is, come and grab one off me and have a look at some of the examples, which are really interesting. And the third one is the bits. So what are the bits of React? As we were saying before, when we're learning to read, we want to learn those individual pieces first. And sounding it out is a good approach for doing that, to know those individual pieces. So this is what React code might look like in a really simple example. But there's actually quite a lot going on here. So I'm going to read some of the comments, and you can see which bits are ES 2015 or React or JSX. So the first couple of lines, we're importing React, and we do that by a combination of what is ES 2015 syntax to use import, and also importing a React library. The third line there, we define a function which makes a string all caps, which is a function actually. It may be new function syntax if you've come from a background of not seeing arrow functions at all before. And then, and this is also particularly confusing for a lot of people, we have a class which extends the React component. People don't get the idea that classes are a concept even outside of React. So when you're being presented with this all at once, it can be easy to miss the fact that these are actually different bits. And so once we get inside the function, there's this render method, which is a method on the class, but it's also one that React is expecting, so that's kind of confusing too. And the last one in the middle, we have an even new concept, which is JSX. So somehow we're able to have something that looks like HTML inside our JavaScript. So there's actually a bunch of different concepts in what is a very typical MVP piece of code for React. So for someone who's just learning, there's lots of stuff going on here, heaps, and it could be hard to understand what those individual bits are. And I really realized this when someone new joined our team and they were learning React, and there was a whole heap of stuff to learn all at once, which was really hard. So to help with that, I made this tool, which is kind of cool. You can hover over the different bits and see what the syntax is and where it comes from. And I made this for the person who had joined our team so they could help understand it. You can click through to the documentation for pieces of syntax too. It's a cool tool. There's some more work that needs to be done on it, if it was going to support TypeScript and other things, but if you want to check it out, there's a glitch thing where you can do that, React or es2015.glitch.me, and you can also remix it on Glitch too, so if you want to play around with how it's actually working and add support to it, that'd be awesome. Another example of how bits are, so who's used Lodash or underscore before? Yeah, heaps of people, awesome. It's easy to forget that not everyone has, particularly people who are just learning. People haven't used those libraries before. My point would be to avoid unnecessary bits in your examples if you can. The reason for this is that it can be distracting for somebody who is trying to learn one concept to be presented with multiple new concepts that they don't also understand. And they'll get distracted by trying to understand what this thing is doing or what that thing is doing instead. So in general, I would just say if you're writing an example, just avoid using help libraries altogether. If you need to, you can just like make some method or abstract it away so that it's not the focus of your example. They're good in practice, but I'd wait until the fundamentals are well understood before introducing these. And so the overall point here is to focus on what's important. There should be a focal point of what you're trying to demonstrate in an example, and either in explaining or writing an example, don't conflate several ideas together, even if they're all important and useful ideas. It's really tempting when you're explaining one thing to get excited or like talk about a different thing, which is also interesting and cool, and then talk about a third thing, and the person you're explaining to is like, oh wow, there's a lot of stuff. So just try and focus on one thing to explain at a time. And overall, understanding the bits. So we need to understand those individual pieces so that we can compose bigger concepts out of those. That's really actually quite easy in React and something that we can do usefully because it's very composable itself, is just break it down into understandable bits and build on top of it. Lastly is motivation. This is obviously a really big part of learning because we're not going to be around forever. So we need to motivate people to help learn themselves. How can we do that? How can we make people be motivated to learn React specifically? Motivation is a key part. And if you think back to the best teacher that you ever had and the worst teacher, think about the difference between those two people. And surely the good teachers that you had motivated you and inspired you to learn more about their topic. And that's what we want to do with the people that we're explaining to as well. We want to motivate and inspire people to learn themselves. Something about teaching someone to fish. It's much more useful if you can get them to learn themselves. And there's this question that you can ask them, which is, what will you make? So that's a really profound question to ask someone who's learning something. And research shows that people are a lot more motivated when they're in control of what they're learning. So giving people freedom to choose what they're learning and the bits of React or the project that they're working on is a big motivating factor for someone who's learning something. And this is also the same from my experience as well. If you can give someone the choice of a project or even the concepts that they want to learn, they're going to be much more motivated to try and learn that. And people learn when they're engaged as well, and this helps engagement. Another big part of this is that people enjoy mastery. So people enjoy and are motivated when they're good at the thing that they're doing. And this is kind of intuitive. As an example, like I originally hated CSS, and over a long period of time, slowly got to almost like a basic level of it, and like now kind of enjoy making like little CSS things or animations. And you talk to people and they think that that's very strange to enjoy it, but I do, and it's probably a large part because I'm able to actually do it. I can like see in my mind what I want to do, and I can execute on that. And that's really satisfying. So as a similar example for React, people don't need to understand everything about React to make something and feel like they're good at it. And so that could be like, they don't need to know how async fetching works or how TypeScript works or how Redux works to know what they want to make. Everyone can make something if they just learn even the most basic concepts. It's really satisfying, even if it's not like that amazing overall, to just be good at one particular thing. So it's another reason for learning those individual bits is that they can be good at those individual bits. So to summarize overall the things that I think are important about this, and hopefully the key takeaways for you. Firstly, learning is important. We really need good teachers, now more than ever, as we have a growing number of people who are learning React and front-end in general. We need people who are able to teach and explain well. So it's extremely important. The second is people won't understand the React the way that you do. The experience that we're having now learning React is different from the experience that someone, even in a couple of months, will have learning React, as things are added and evolved over time. And so don't assume that people should learn in the same way that you did. Everyone's different, and they're coming from different backgrounds. And lastly, the most important question of all is to ask, what will you make? So now that people have the tools and explaining of like how things work as well, I'll ask you the same question, which is, who will you explain to? Right? There's for sure someone who might be on your team, or even not on your team, like in your life, who doesn't understand, but would like to understand a little bit more about what it is that you do or how React works. And I would encourage you to talk to that person and just give it a go at explaining some concept or something that they're interested in learning. Cool, thanks very much for listening. If you have questions or feedback about the talk, I don't know if we have time for questions, you can go to that URL and you can send me a message. And I also have the slides linked down the bottom, but references to the research and the links that I shared during that. But otherwise, yeah, thank you.
Good job, Josh.